Time for sound design. In today's video, I'm gonna create a multi-sampled instrument in Ableton, meaning that I'm gonna sample one instrument several times, so several different notes in different octaves, and in that way create a instrument that not relies on one sample like I've done in many previous videos, but it relies on multiple samples to create a more detailed and you could say complex instrument. The instrument that I'm gonna sample is the Casio MT140 keyboard, and on this keyboard there's a bunch of different preset tones, and I'm gonna go for the vibraphone. And this is a 4-octave keyboard, so I'm gonna sample at least 2 notes per octave, and then put all those notes into a sampler and assign them to different parts of the octave range. So in this video I will walk you through the entire process of recording the notes into Ableton, chopping them up, mapping them to different zones, and then also go through the different tabs in sampler to add modulation, filter, envelope, effects, and save it as an instrument track. You might wonder why I go to the trouble of creating a sampled instrument from this cheap keyboard, and there are several reasons for that. One of the reasons is that this keyboard doesn't have MIDI, so if you want to program this, it's not possible. You have to actually play it, and it has like these little kind of plasticky keys, and it doesn't have any effects or a filter, so it is limited in that sense. But when I sample the notes and create a software instrument, I have more control over it. I can add filter cutoff, I can add modulation and effects, and it's just easier to work with once it is in Ableton. So that is basically the reason. So let's hook this thing up and start sampling. The vibraphone sounds like this. What I will do is I will start at the, let's say, the lowest note. I will do, it's 4 octaves, so they're plus 1, so it's 5 times the note C, and then in between I will take the, what should I do? Take the F and then end with the C. And I will just ring the notes out completely, so that should be quite straightforward. Let's record. So that's it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 notes. So 5 C's and 4 F's. So now that we have these 9 notes recorded into Ableton, I will cut them up and crop them. And I change the start and end point and name them accordingly. And once we have done that, it's time to go to map them, to import them into sampler, or drag them into sampler and map them to different zones. So it is important to stay organized with this kind of activities. So let's cut them up and say this is C1. There are 4 octaves, so I'm going to call them C1 to C4. So cutting up a sample, you can use Command E or Control E to, if you have your cursor, to basically cut. So this is then F1, F4 and C5. And now I will go into each sample and adjust the start and end point, so I don't have to later do that in sampler. And you want to cut quite close to the beginning, but not too close. Let's crop this. I like to zoom in to see where it starts, so I don't cut it too short, because you can't change it later. So now that they are all nicely starting at the right point and they have a name, the tail is very long, I didn't really crop that because I can later do that in sampler with the release time. It's the global release time, so I don't have to, that the tail is long, it doesn't really matter at this point. So now that we have this, it's time to go to sampler. So if we open sampler, we have these different tabs: zone, sample, pitch, oscillator, filter, global, modulation, and MIDI. And I'm going to use some of these tabs in this video. The first one is the zone. So if you open it, you get this extra window above, which you can rescale like this. And here you can, if you work with multiple samples like in this video, you can drop in the samples and you can assign what is the key range. So in what octaves should this sample play. And that is important because we have multiple samples, but we don't want to play them all at once. We only want them to play in a certain range of the keyboard. And what I want to do is that I want to play the actual note that the sample is playing. So if you have the F1, I want the sample to play the F1 and then all the notes below that until the next sample. So I only want to pitch down, I don't want to pitch up, because usually pitching down sounds better. But maybe it's better just to explain it by doing it. So let's go start with the first sample, and let's start with the highest sample actually. So what I want to do is I want to set the root to C5, because that's what it is C5. If I play now a C5 on the keyboard, this is how the sample sounds. So if you play the sample, it is correct. So we're playing at the same note. And if we look at the key range here, we basically want to play, since this is the highest note that we sampled, we want to play maybe one octave up, so up to a C6. And then we want to go basically down to, the next sample is an F4. So we want to play up down to an F sharp 4. So if we go to, now it's F sharp 4. So if we go, and then if we play an F, you see there's no sample, so nothing plays. This is basically how you can make each sample only play pitch down, and then for the first and the last one I do add an extra octave to the end. So now it's just adding all the samples and changing the key ranges, and make sure that the root note is the actual note that that the sample is in. And that's why it's important to name your sample, so you remember that it's a C or an F and in which octave it was. Okay, let's continue with sample 2, the F4. So I drag that on top of here and I put the root note to F4, and I want to play up till an F4 because that's what it is. So that's, and if I play the sample, it's the same. I'm going to change the volume in global to -6 to boost the entire session. And then I want to pitch this one down up to the next sample. The next sample is a C4. So I want to play up to a C sharp 4. That's only a few notes. And then we go to the next sample. So the highest note I want to play is a C1, and then the lowest note I can want to play, I mean, I can just go all the way down, but that doesn't sound good. So maybe the lowest note is a C0. So I play from C0 to C1, just add some extra notes in the end, just in case. I mapped all the notes to the correct zones and I set the correct root notes. So now, as you can see, if you go through the list C1, you can see root C1. And you can see that the range is completely, there's no overlap, there's not one note that plays two samples. So the next thing to do is to go to the next tab, the filter and global tab. And here I want to set the release time to a bit shorter than 10 seconds, so maybe 2.5 seconds. And you can see now when we play a chord, you play different samples. But it doesn't sound like different samples. Now that we're in the filter and global tab, let's use the filter, since the original keyboard doesn't have any kind of filter. It's just a preset sound and you can't change any of that. So let's use the filter in Sampler to filter the sound a bit. And I'm thinking, what if we can use the filter envelope here and put the amount to... So now I use the filter envelope to kind of create a bit more of a muted sound when I... So without this, you really have that strong attack, which is typical of a vibraphone. But now with the filter envelope, it's a bit more muted. The other thing, what I'm thinking, let's add some modulation. So going to the modulation tab and picking this LFO, picking the first LFO, and maybe actually add some tremolo. So let's add it to the volume. But let's change the rate to 16th. All right, so now that we have a little bit of tremolo, we have the filter modulation, let's add some effects. So the first one I want to add is reverb, and we can add quite a big reverb because we can later assign it to a macro, so we can tone it down a bit to create a bit more stereo spread as well. And the other thing I want to add is something of a drive. There is in the filter here in Sampler, there's also a drive. So if I go for the MS2, for instance, this is a nice drive. Let's use the drive from Sampler. So that's actually maybe enough already in terms of sound design. So we have the drive from the filter, we have the modulation, the tremolo, and you have the filter cutoff or the filter modulation, and then a reverb. So let's assign some of these parameters to macros, so we can create sort of the instrument that we want. And for this, I'm going to select the sampler, the tuner, the utility, the EQ, and the reverb, and group them, Ctrl G or Command G, into an instrument rack. And now we can assign macros. So the first one would be the drive of in the filter global tab, assign it to macro 1, so filter drive. The second one is the amount of volume modulation or tremolo. So going to modulation tab, LFO 1 volume percentage. So we rename this to tremolo. And then the third macro is the size of the reverb, so the decay, and the dry wet of the reverb. So now that we have this, we have 4 parameters mapped to our instrument. So if we start playing with this, so if we turn everything down basically, this is the basic sound. Let's put in a chord actually. And let's turn off the filter drive. So you can already, with 3 parameters, you can really kind of change the sound, make it a bit more gritty, create some movement in there, create a bit of space with the reverb. So let's try to find some sweet spots and make some presets in this instrument rack. So for presets, I think they're called snapshots here. Click on this icon here. That's sort of a, what is it? A photo camera. So if I turn everything down, that's my first variation. I call it basic. And then what I just had, Call it movement. So now if you click on basic, it loads these parameters. If I double click on movement, it loads these parameters. So this is very one-dimensional. Let's create a third one that is much more gritty. So really turn up the drive. With a little bit of reverb. Let's call this one drive. And let's create one more variation where we're gonna add a bit of tremolo, no drive, a lot of reverb, like a 10-second reverb. And let's call it spacey. So now that we have an instrument rack with all the samples and the effects and a few presets, let's save this to my library of instruments. So I'm going to call it the Casio vibraphone multi-sample. All right, so that's it for this video. I sampled the vibraphone from this keyboard, the Casio MT140. I sampled 9 notes across the 4 octaves of the keyboard, so 5 times a C, because there's an extra C at the end, and then 4 times an F in between. Then I mapped these to, I used Sampler to map them to the different zones, and I created some modulation in Sampler and added some reverb and assigned those to macro parameters. This is a way how you can create a multi-sampled instrument in Ableton from a vintage cheap keyboard. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about the process of multi-sampling, and let me know what kind of instruments you have created with multi-sampling, either from electronic sources or acoustic sources. And if you have any tips or tricks when it comes to multi-sampling. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.